You know, since 2022, the government of Ghana has lost access to the international capital market, but now things are better. The government can go to the capital market, but they are saying they won't go. But because we lost access in the year 2022, it may be a reason. You also know that we can then fall on multilateral loans, but multilateral loans sometimes are program or project specific and may involve painstaking pre-approval procedures. There are also conditionalities that are attached to the multilateral loans, so that disbursement may not take place before one meets certain requirements. Some of these loans are also tied to particular projects and programs, making it difficult to repurpose such funds in response to changing priorities. And that the last reason could be a deliberate attempt by the government not to draw on those loans. And you could feel the posture of the finance minister that the fifth point may be true, because he said he is not going to be pushed to take any loan. But whatever the justification may be, this has the downside of disrupting budget implementation in affected agencies. We take a look at the fiscal balances, the fiscal deficit on commitment basis, on cash basis, primary balance on commitment basis, on cash basis. Maybe just to give you a simple difference between commitment and cash. When the government promises a company, a construction company, that go and construct, I'll pay you, and it gives a letter, it becomes part of the deficit. On cash, unless they pay, it becomes part of the cash deficit. We've seen that throughout the first half of the year, we were expecting an expansionary fiscal policy, because that was a promise in the 2026 main budget against contractionary fiscal policy in the year 2025, which was understandable. But in the first half of 2026, we are still seeing the continuation of a contractionary fiscal policy. And it's evident here. Blue actual, the red line for budgeted, and the yellow for the actual in 2025. Throughout the period, you see, for example, the first half of 2026, the budget of fiscal balance on commitment basis was negative 2.0. The actual is negative 0.4. Same with balance on cash basis. The budget was negative 2.9% of GDP. These are percentage of GDP. In the first half of the year, we have realized 0.8% of GDP. You can say similar story about primary balance on commitment basis and on cash basis. I did some check yesterday before coming. Look at the negative 2.9 target for the first half year. Based on the downward revision of the revenue, which is now at 124.8 billion, even if the government maintained the 124.8 billion revenue and spent all the expenditure projections for the half year, still the budget deficit would have been 2.1% of GDP, still below the projection of negative 2.9. So that's why we believe that the 2026 budget's posture is more of contractionary than expansionary, as promised in the main budget. The implications are that the gap between revenue and expenditure cannot be closed only by reducing expenditure. The government is embarking on expenditure-led fiscal consolidation. By CPS, we believe that you can embark on fiscal consolidation through a revenue-led. So this is the gap. We have revenue down, expenditure up. You can close the gap by reducing expenditure. You can also close the gap by raising revenue. And therefore, it is a matter of concern. These substantial reduction allocations, as we have demonstrated, for government delivery expenditures, goods and services, capital expenditure, goods to other government units and social benefits, have the potential to reduce output. reduce economic activities. But when there are calls for the government to increase expenditure to spend, it is not just about quantity, it's about the quality of the expenditure. And therefore, efficient spending of the funding of the funds is really important. There's something that we have found in the budget, I think since 2025, which CPS commends the government for doing. That is the fact that the MDAs will need expenditure authorization before they can commit the state to any loan or any project. That one, I think, is a laudable idea, and we commend the minister. But we believe that going forward, they should engage with the MDAs, because this is it. You prepare the budget with them. So now give us the money to execute. You say bring commitment authorization. So CPS position is that, yes, going forward, why don't you have a proper plan with them so that the budgeting will be smooth and the execution will also be smooth, other than this back and forth that they are doing with the MDAs. And there are also data inconsistencies in the budget, which we believe should be addressed. For instance, the total expenditure on commitment basis was stated on page 25 as 129.2 billion as against the target of 158.6 billion. Meanwhile, in the same document on page 26, the figure changes to 136.9 billion against a target of 172.5 billion. Similarly, capital expenditure estimates on page 25 stated 21.7 billion against the target of 36.6 billion, but on page 26, the actual half-year 2026 capex changes to 22.2 billion. So when we're doing analysis, we didn't know which figure to choose, whether we should choose 21 or we should use 22. And the difference is significant. These inconsistencies must be addressed, since they go to the root of budget credibility. Let's turn our attention to the monetary sector. First on the list, inflation. We are witnesses of the fact that inflation has been dropping from as high as 54% in the December 2022, then 23% by December 2024. We have been experiencing a decline in inflation, but according to the governor, the disinflation process has stalled, and this is the evidence. After April 2026, we are seeing inflation inching up for obvious reasons, and inflation has been largely driven by non-food. You know, we have food and non-food. If you see how utilities have been adjusted upwards, the energy costs, transport costs, it's evident that the non-food inflation will be higher than the food. Also, we have the local versus imported inflation. And Ghana's inflation in recent times has been more of local, not imported, because even the exchange rate is a bit stable. Now, let's take through where the inflation is coming from. Top 10 items in Ghana that drive Ghana's inflation, according to the June inflation dynamics. Bus and trotro fares, payment for rent, high school fees, though there's free SHS, ginger, fish, cooked rice, tomatoes, yam, accommodation and plantain. These are the items that are driving Ghana's inflation today. Therefore, if we want to find solution to inflation, we know where to look at. In terms of regional distribution of inflation, Northeast region has consistently given us the highest regional inflation, always in the double digits, when the whole country is having a single digit. Meanwhile, their neighboring region, their neighbor, Savannah, has also been having the lowest regional inflation consistently. So two neighboring regions, one with the highest regional inflation, one in the lowest regional inflation. I think these two regions need to be studied. I want to know what is going on. Maybe they are rivals or something. The other regions with their regional inflations above the national average are Ashanti, Greater Accra, Central, Volta, and Eastern region. Energy cost in recent times, you know, could raise the cost of production and further compound the inflation in Ghana. Monetary policy rate. The blue line is for the nominal one, the one you've been hearing the BOG announce all the time. the red one, or orange, whatever the color is, the orange line is the real monetary policy rate, which is the difference between the nominal and inflation rate. It is significant because when you read the decisions of the MPC members, before they arrive at the decision of to move it up or down, they look at the movement of the real monetary policy rate, which is the orange color. If it's going down, then it necessitates an upward adjustment of the nominal policy rate. So, as you can see, it started going down after May 2026. And per our own estimation, if it goes below 7%, in the next MPC meeting, they are likely to increase the policy rate. So BOG has always maintained these low policy rates to maintain a strong monetary anchor. The low policy rate, has also lowered lending costs and improved liquidity, also increased private sector credit. It's been maintained around 14% since March 2026. And like I said, any drop of the real MPR below 7 will necessitate an upward adjustment of the next policy rate. In terms of the exchange rate, we know our cedi was performing very well in the 2025. By December, it was around 40%, the USD to cedi rate. But now, since January 2026, look at that. We are seeing a depreciation of it over the period. But we hope that the exchange rate will be stabilized throughout the year 2026, given all dynamics and restoring fiscal discipline through careful expenditure control, enhanced domestic revenue mobilization, and targeted social interventions are also key for the sustainability of the exchange rate. A fall in commodity prices due to the strengthening of the global economy and escalation of geopolitical tensions could also pose downward risk to our inflation dynamics and also the exchange rate, because import bills will be higher. Now, the conversation of intervention versus intermediation. I think CPS, we stressed on this last time, but it has come up again. We need to address it again. We all know that Ghana practices the managed floating exchange rate regime, where we allow the exchange rate to float, and when it becomes excessive, that's the word that the governor uses. When it becomes excessive, then they will intervene. Our checks with the Bank of Ghana suggest that they have not quantified the excessive or excessiveness. What figure do you put on as excessive? Is it 20% depreciation, 15%? They have not quantified it. They just sit there and say, once it's excessive, based on their own estimation, then they move on. But if you want to infer from ECOWAS exchange rate depreciation or appreciation band of plus 10 minus 10, and Ghana is a member, then you could say that the excessiveness in terms of the definition by ECOWAS means that any time the cedi depreciates by 10%, it will call for an intervention by the central bank. The capacity of the central bank to intervene always depends on the reserve accumulation, as you know. Currently, we have about $12.9 billion and about 24.4 tons of gold holdings. So do they have the capacity now? Yes. The question is, for how long can they intervene? If today gold price drops, it becomes a problem for us in terms of our reserve accumulation. The minority always would criticize the government for their heavy intervention. The response by the government and the central bank is that they are doing intermediation and not intervention. We know that in other countries, exports revenue are saved by the commercial banks. They go through the commercial banks. Therefore, the commercial banks have that liberty to adjust, move up and down of the exchange rate. But in Ghana, the entire exchange rate is saved by the central bank. So their response is that they are playing the role which should have been played by the commercial banks. That's why they are calling it intermediation. But the theory of financial intermediation is that that role must be played by financial intermediaries, and the central bank is not a financial intermediary. Financial intermediaries play this role of intervention to make profit. The central bank is not there to make that profit. Therefore, no matter how they call it, we still call it intervention. Though we do not condemn the act of intervention, we just condemn the semantics, the definitions. Whatever they are doing is still intervention. Let's look at the lending rate. We see the movement of monetary policy rates having an impact on lending rates, and in Ghana, I think that's the first question that people will ask. Anytime they reduce policy rates, they look at, oh, what will be the impact on lending rate? So the correlation between them has been moderate of 0.629. 0.629. Correlation moves between 0 and 1. A strong correlation is 1. A weak one is close to 0. So if it's around 0.6, it's a bit moderate. The reason is that lending rate determinants, they don't look at only the policy rate. They look at other things, like non-performing loans. Sterilization. To maintain monetary expansion or contraction, then the central bank will always intervene in the open market operations. In the year 2025, as you recall from the Bank of Ghana financial statements, about 93 billion was sterilized at a cost of 16.7 billion in a bid to reduce inflation. The consequence, as we know, the BOG made a loss and its equity is in the negative, and the Bank of Ghana needs recapitalization. This has been captured in the main budget, it has been captured in the mid-year budget. The Bank of Ghana needs recapitalization. Therefore, given the present position of the Bank of Ghana, they cannot continue to sterilize as they did in 2025. And that inflation targeting should be a shared responsibility. BOG is not in the position to take the bullet on our behalf again. It should be a shared responsibility between the BOG, the fiscal, and the real sectors like agriculture, industry, transportation, road, communication, because we saw how ginger, tomatoes, plantain were driving Ghana's inflation. And this is not the BOG solution. It should be Ministry of Agric solution. So fighting inflation should be a shared responsibility. Private sector credit growth. We have seen a big jump of credit growth from the third quarter of 2025, obviously because of the downward trend of the MPR. But we have seen this gap between the real, these are real figures, not nominal, real, the real private sector credit growth and the real GDP growth. The gap keeps widening, and it raises certain questions. The question is that who is getting the credit? Because advancing credit is not an end in itself, it's a means to economic growth. So you have this explosion of this real figure. We have taken away inflation effect. This big explosion, and yet economic growth is not responding that much. Let me give you another scenario. If the credit goes to an importer of finished commodity, not importation of intermediaries, finished commodity, any importation of a finished commodity enters into the calculation of GDP as a negative value. So you advance more credit to importers to import finished products. Your credit though is up, but your GDP is down because of the way we calculate GDP, where imports enter into the calculation as negative values. Gold board. The Precious Minerals Marketing Company, PMMC, now Gold Board. The mandate is to use Ghana's status as Africa's largest gold producer to build reserves. And it's understandable because last year we produced about 6.3 million ounces of gold, that's about 150 tons. And so there's every reason for us to, as a nation, build more reserves or even take advantage of the blessing that God has bestowed on us. We also know that a BOG has reported that they have ceased pre-financing the activities of the Gold Board. And at the time Ghana started this Gold for Reserves program in 2021, the entire nation's gold reserves were just 8 tons from independence to 2021, just 8. Within the space of 3 years, the Gold for Reserves program has increased the reserves from 8 to 18, to 38 by the end of 2024. Some of the gold holdings were sold. Remember, in the 2025 financial statement of the Bank of Ghana, they admitted that some of the golds were sold to make the books look a bit better than it would have been, and that we ended the year with about 18.6 tons of gold. Currently, it's around 24.4 tons of gold. But the point is, Ghana produces similar gold as Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Mexico. And these gold-producing peers of Ghana have their gold holdings above 100 tons. We are doing 24. We have a long way to go, and we can do better. Our reserves are woefully below what our peers are producing. We turn attention to the external sector. First, the commodity prices. Gold on the far left, in the upper left of your screen. We've seen the increase in gold prices because of, sometimes the war also benefits Ghana because investors are moving from dollar-denominated investment to gold holdings. And Ghana is the largest producer of gold in Africa. And therefore, we are benefiting from the gold price surge. It's dropped, but it's still around more than a bit, 4,000 or so. On the far right, upper right, cocoa, you've seen a sharp drop of cocoa price from over 10,000 in January 2025 to now roughly around 4,000 in June 2026. That's why cocoa farmers are struggling. Cocoa board is also struggling. We have seen the volatility also in cocoa price. That of crude oil was better until the war, and you see a jump in crude oil price down there. It's coming down. It went up over $100 per barrel. Today it's around 80. I think last night I checked it was $88 per barrel. We just hope that it will continue to drop. The external balance remains resilient. You've seen the fluctuations in gold prices, fluctuations also in cocoa prices. Ghana's gold accounts for 68% of our total exports. The conversation is that the government should try and pay the farmers the right price, no matter the situation. Because when the price was high, they were enjoying. Now they have to secure the livelihood of cocoa farmers. Crude oil price conversation. Ghana is an exporter of crude oil. And therefore, usually people say, oh, when the price rises, then the country should also benefit. But our checks suggest that the cost far outweigh the benefit of any increment in crude oil price. You see how crude oil price increments, because of the war, not only the price, but also insurance, freight costs, they are all rising. Therefore, they will feed into refined oil. Then transport costs, just yesterday I heard in the news that the GPRTU, they are trying to increase their fares by 30%. So these are the compounding effects of energy costs. And so the negatives far outweigh the positives. So the current account, capital account, and the gross international reserves. Ghana has recorded positive current account, in fact, driven by a trade balance surplus. In fact, our trade balance surplus has been since first quarter of 2017, when we discovered new oil wells, obviously driven by gold and crude oil. So I always tell my students that when we say Ghana is an import-dependent economy, it does not mean that we import more than we export. It means that our consumption is import-dependent. In fact, look at the tutorial. I'm sure even what you are wearing is imported. Almost everything is imported. The strong current account and the inflows of the capital account would help together the country to acquire more international reserves. And we have reserves of 12.9 billion, 5 months import cover. The table, let's move. You take a careful look at this table, you see that throughout all the items in the balance of payments, the first half of 2026, the figures are superior to the first half of 2025, with the exception of gold holdings. So we cannot be the number one producer of gold in Africa and still have this. So we have to up our game. The new gold purchase arrangements that the government wants to purchase about 30% from the large-scale gold miners, and also almost all production by the small-scale miners. It's a laudable idea. We just hope that the government can achieve that, and that will help us in a long way, because then once you accumulate more reserves, your currency will be stabilized, and it will have positive impact on inflation. Let's turn our attention to physical and human capital. Obviously, this discussion will start with CAPEX, capital expenditure. Let's go through the table, and you can appreciate the argument here. First column, the years 2025 budget estimate, then it was revised in the 2026 budget this is the total expenditure, the column 2 is the total expenditure, column 1 is the full budget, the revision, and then the provisional. So 2025 PROV, provisional, means that this is what has been achieved. Provisional means they can revise it later, but so far that's what we have. And then we have the full year of 2026 in the main budget, then the half year of 2025, the target versus provisional, then we have half year of 2026, the target and the provisional. The reason we are showing you this is still the argument we made earlier about the cutting of expenditure, especially the capital expenditure. In the 2025 full budget, look at the last column. As a ratio of the total expenditure, it was supposed to be 12, but we ended the year with 8.6%. Look at the full year budget estimate. The allocation is supposed to be 19% of total expenditure, but by half year, we are doing 16.8. But this 16.8, 21.7 total CAPEX, which has been spent, is 40.7% less than what was budgeted for at 36.6 billion. And therefore, the argument we made earlier still stands, that the government has been cutting down expenditure of 14 billion cedis has not been spent. But the road to my area is bad. I'm sure the road to your hometown needs to be fixed. And then we made a point earlier that given the revised figures of total revenue and grants, even if the government has spent all the intended expenditure, still the budget deficit would have been 2.1% of GDP instead of 2.9 target. So why do you cut 14 billion from CAPEX when we need our roads to be fixed? So this tight fiscal and monetary stance that we have observed in the first half of 2026, maybe by the second half of 2026, things will be better. But observations so far suggest that things have been tight. That shift towards growth, investment, and job creation is in doubt, as was stated in the main budget. So total expenditure for the year 2026 financial year was estimated at 302.5 billion, an increase of 20.1 billion percent from 2021 projections. Of this, 57.5 billion should have been allocated to CAPEX, representing 19%, but so far, only 21.7 billion has been spent. There's a need to, down the next slide. When we are teaching aggregate demand and GDP in the classroom, the components, if you remember, level 100, we say GDP is equal to C plus I plus J plus NX. That I there is both public and private. In Ghana, the C accounts for about 75%, the I accounts for about 18%. the rest, from government consumption, expenditure, and the rest. If you want your economy to grow, transform, and create jobs, you need to keep that eye up, growing very fast. And so in as much as there is stability, low inflation, exchange rate is stable, and you believe that will encourage private sector investment, there's also the need for the government to complement private investment with public investment. The reason is that certain public goods and services must be provided by the government. You will not see the private person like maybe CPS constructing our road. We won't do that. Water, electricity, passport, driver's license, and all that. So we believe that the government should increase or scale up the public investment to complement private investment for growth and development. 24-hour economy. Last year, CPS re-scrutinized the document of the 24-hour economy, and we found out that out of the 287 pages, the shift system, which was promised us, appeared only once, on page 18, once. The entire document is not about shift system. It's not about 133. The entire document is about economic growth and transformation. But we see the building of 24-hour markets around the country. So you take a look at the manifesto, the document, and what is being done, different things. Different things. Why would one establish 24-hour market to sell imported commodities? Because in your document, you want to grow and transform first before the shift system. Why do you go ahead of yourself to establish markets to sell what has not been produced, but to sell what has been imported? We also saw that in terms of funding, the Secretariat has consistently said that funding will be sourced from the private sector, and that government will give them a seed money. In the 2026 budget, the seed money of 110 million was given to the Secretariat. We also know from the document that there was a promise of economic growth of about 6% of GDP and a job creation by the end of 2026 of 828,000, 1.76 million by 2028, and 5.3 million jobs by 2034. Our labor economist is here. I'm sure he'll throw more light on it. The job creation capacity of the whole country is about 660,000 a year. But 24-hour economy alone is promising 828,000 by 2026. And the jobs are nowhere to be found. But in the mid-year budget, they have indicated, to be fair to the Secretariat, that they said the funding will come from private. They have indicated that they have made progress sourcing about $11.5 billion, and about 5.5 has already been secured for the development of power to the Volta Economic Corridor. Last year, CPS also said that we have read the document, 287 pages, and our observation was that even if the government fails at all, they should not fail the project, this Volta Economic Corridor. It's a brilliant idea. So we just pray that that project should come to light because of how it is going to link the south and the north. They have even said that in terms of transportation, they are going to travel or transport goods, services, or goods and human beings on the Volta Lake from the south to the north, even up to Burkina Faso. Such a brilliant idea. We just hope that it will be implemented. The first half of 2026 has not accounted for any job creation in the 24-hour economic program. You read the budget, you cannot find any job which has been created so far. It's important for the government to account for this, to get the buy-in of the citizens. Big push. In the year 2026, the government earmarked about 30 billion for big push, 13.8 billion for road construction and others. So far, by end of June 2026, 6.5 billion had been allocated. 13 projects, and most of them are in various stages of completion. We also have been told that the government has secured about $1.7 billion for the Kumasi-Accra Highway Expressway. That's also a very brilliant idea. If it's done, it will go a long way to help transportation of people and goods. This has been ring-fenced for the construction of the highway. The Big Push program should not be seen as a mere infrastructure drive, but should be seen as a nation-building strategy to connect people, markets, opportunities, and to ensure that growth is shared across every region. Though the government has made some substantial progress in terms of preparation, we still believe that the government has a role to play in terms of the provision of public goods, and therefore, public investment must be scaled up. The government has an objective of intensifying the urban electricity and also rural electricity, energy, and the idea is to make power more affordable and reliable for production and also for consumption, household consumption. And $2 billion has been set for the Rural Electrification Acceleration and Urban Intensification Initiative. And therefore, it's a laudable idea. If they're able to achieve it, it will be good for us because we all need power for our homes and for our factories. Human capital, emphasis on education and health. We know that the government recently launched the free primary health care to ensure access to quality health care and that no Ghanaian should be left out. Currently, about 150 districts have been covered, about 24,000 pieces of equipment have been distributed so far, and that the FPH is not to replace the NHIS, but to complement it. And the government has also, in terms of education, the government has sourced about 300 million from the World Bank to help build about 210 educational infrastructure. Of course, they said they want to get rid of the double-track system. If they are successful, it will go a long way to improve educational system in Ghana. Feasibility of infrastructure financing. We know we have raised concern about the cut in capex, by 140.7 or 6%, which is not a good thing, and this puts in doubt the whole government's objective of expanding the economy. Improve macroeconomic stability, reduce debt burden, can also create space for measured borrowing, and they are all important to support payment stability for ongoing projects. The Big Push program has demonstrated less commitment, fiscal commitment, readiness in the first half of 2026. The hope is that it will be improved in the second half of 2026. And there's also the need for political support. I believe the finance minister has it from the president. Must also commit to the contracts. We've heard in the news that some contractors are complaining, so it's our hope that the ministry will commit to the payment of these contracts, which remain hopeful for economic growth. I'll pause here, I'll come back. I'll pause here for our labor economists, but I'll come back. I'm not done with you, I'll come back. For our labor economists to take us through employment and growth, and then I'll come back. Thank you.
I think Dr. Sarko deserves another round of applause. All right, so let me stand on existing protocols to welcome you. Let me begin by being a bit scriptural. All right, so somewhere in the Bible, it says, what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? And if a nation has good macroeconomic indicators and wild ideas, and it is unable to translate into tangible jobs for the people, then it makes nonsense of all the economic achievement. And that is why this discussion is very important. All right, so the end result is that target must be translated into actions, and actions must produce results. All right, so what we intend to do with economic growth and employment is to review the flagship programs and assess what has been done and what needs to be done. All right. So in analyzing the labor market, um, we first of all want to understand something. In every economy or in every labor market, we have what's called a working population. The working population is made up of those who are in the labor force and those who are outside the labor force. By the ILO convention, um, any person 15 years and above is considered eligible to be part of the working population. So if you look at what we have here, what we have done is to, based on the AHIS report, talk about the pattern of employment um, in the first 3 quarters of 2025. Now, the working population is made up of the labor force and those outside the labor force. And when you take the labor force, we can disaggregate it into those who are employed and those who are unemployed. If you look at the 3 quarters in 2025, you will notice that across the first 3 quarters, more than 15 million people consider the labor force, and with about 87% of them being employed. We notice that in the 3rd quarter, the share of those who are outside the labor force actually increased. Now, if you look at the nominal figures, over 330,000 people in the 3rd quarter were employed in addition to the 1st quarter. If we make an extrapolation based on what Dr. Sarkodie said, if we go by this 330,000 figure, then we can make an assertion that maybe by the end of the year, we could have a doubling of this figure. A doubling will mean that we have about 660,000, people employed. Now, if you match this to some of the program targets, it makes the target a bit, questionable. The point we want to raise here is that, yes, employment generation is increasing, but there's more room for improvement. We will now want to turn to the sectoral growth, see how the economy has grown, and analyze whether this growth has translated into real jobs for the people. So if you look at sectoral growth between 2025 and 2026, what we see is that in the 1st quarter of 2026, growth is averaging 6.4%. But this is not the highest that we could achieve. I mean, somewhere in 2012, we had 13.3%. All right, so 6.4 may look good, but it is still below the threshold. I mean, what we have done in ages past. In terms of the sectorial growth, we see that industry is leading the pack with 6.9%. If we look at the growth of industry, we see that there's a rebound because in 2025, around the same time, industry grew 2.3%. So you could see that industry is doing very well. And what is accounting for this industrial growth is largely emanating from mining, quarrying, and then oil production. There's a certain spike in our oil production. We see a lot of activities within the mining sector driven by gold production, and that has actually contributed to the surge and the rebound in the industrial sector. We also notice that the service sector has grown by 7.1%. If we are to look at the 3 sectors, service recorded the highest growth, but if we compare 2026 to 2025, we can say that the rebound is much higher in the industrial sector. What is accounting for the growth in the services is largely due to transformation in ICT. There's a lot of digital action going on. We see a lot of mobile data consumption. There are more investment in the digital space. Now everything is becoming digital, and so a lot of investment is going in there, and that is contributing to the growth in the service sector. Agric, unfortunately, has slumped, and in this first year, um, growing by 4.0%. Let me mention that the contraction of agric is due to the fact that the fishing subsector had not performed very well. In the first half of the year, the fishing subsector has grown negatively by 18.5%. What we can observe from the trend of growth is that the sectors that are labor intensive uh, and have high employment generation are rather growing slowly, whilst those with low employment generation are growing faster. If this pattern should continue, we are going to have what we call a jobless growth. Growth may be increasing, but this growth may not be translating into real jobs. Kindly skip this one. All right. So let's talk about employment categories. We are using this as a base to set an argument to analyze how far we have gone with the flagship policies. For us to make a determination whether or not a flagship policy is successful or has been successful, we would want to look at the promised job. I mean, what was said in the political manifesto, and what are the projected jobs? I mean, what are the estimated jobs based on the project value or based on a multiplier effect? You know, some projects have a value chain. So if we estimate along the value chain, how many jobs are going to be created? And then for programs that involves enrollment, for instance, like the TVET program, the apprenticeship program, how many enrolled beneficiaries can we account for? People who have registered for the program. It is important to know this. A person can be enrolled but may not be trained because we can have an attrition. So how many people are trained beneficiaries? All right, so people who actually register and receives the program. We can also look at temporary jobs. If you take like the construction sector, for instance, in road construction, a lot of hands are engaged, but these projects usually have a lifespan, and once the project ends, they are disengaged. So, how many temporary jobs are ascertained? How many jobs are verified jobs? Okay, so when we pick, for instance, the payroll of an entity, how many people are on the payroll? How many people have written contracts? If we come to CPS, for instance, and we look at the payroll, we can actually verify the number of staffs here, those who are casual, etc. And how many sustained jobs or permanent jobs do we have? In labor market studies, if somebody is employed continuously between 6 to 12 months, we consider that to be a sustained job. And obviously, there are indirect jobs as well. All right. So, in analyzing the effectiveness of the flagship policies, we have in mind these metrics. So, what is the verdict based on our assessment? Next line, please. If you look at program by program, let's first look at the big push, which my colleague mentioned earlier. The manifesto promise was that Big Push is projecting about 490,000 jobs. All right, but What we see by mid-year 2026 is that these 490 jobs, we do not have verifiable data to confirm that these jobs have actually been created. What we see is that there are 87 projects that have commenced, and if we assess completion rates of these 87 projects, 28 of them are above 25% completion rate, and 59 projects are below the completion rate. This means that yes, implementation has begun, but there's more room for improvement. We need to have verifiable data on how many sustained jobs, how many temporary jobs have been created in this regard. It means that it will be difficult for us to pass a conclusive verdict that this big push has generated the number of jobs it says it has. An aspect of this big push is the Accra Kumasi Expressway. This is a project that is also estimated to produce 30,000 jobs. What is the state of progress as at mid-year 2026? As at mid-year 2026, what we see is that we are still prospecting because these jobs have actually not been executed. What we see now is that we are in the design stage where the right of way is being cleared. And I'm happy to report that as at July 2026, 122 kilometers of the expressway has been cleared. According to verifiable data from the Ministry of Finance, it is expected that in September 2026, procurement issues will begin and construction will commence. It is anticipated that when procurement is passed and construction begins, we can have access to verifiable data, how many people have been hired as sustained workers and also as temporary workers. This means that it is difficult to also get conclusive figures as employment based on the target that have been set. Now let's move to the agricultural enclave roads. In the 2026 budget, this was also mentioned to project 25,000 jobs. Let me mention that as we speak, the implementation has commenced, but we cannot report of the exact number of jobs created. The original plan is to create 1,050-kilometer feeder roads across 4 enclaves and within the agricultural corridors. As we speak right now, only one corridor has been given the green light. And so we do not have verifiable data to suggest that these 25,000 jobs have been created. It means that these jobs are prospective jobs, but they are not actual jobs. If you look at the promise on establishing 3 garment factories across the Bono region, the central region, and then the eastern region, the original plan was that these garment factories were going to run a 3-shift, system to create about 27,000 jobs. As we speak right now, transaction advisors have been engaged to identify strategic investors to come and invest. So this promise is still at the preparatory stage. There are no verifiable records to suggest that X number of people, have been employed or otherwise. Then the agro-processing plants. There was a promise to also establish 7 agro-processing plants in northern region, central region, Ahafo region, Bono region, northeast region, and western north region. The expectation was to process products like yam, fish, cashew, poultry, rice, etc. And about 700 direct jobs were also expected. As we speak now, none of these agro processing plants have seen the light of day. It is still in the preparation stage. So we do not have sufficient evidence to talk about real numbers on this. Then the multiple shift system, which is an offshoot of the 24-hour economy. As we speak right now, 326 entities are reported to be running multiple shifts. But ladies and gentlemen, what we need to know is that running a multiple shift is not suggestive that employment has increased. I mean, we could have a job rotation where the same number of workers, can be running multiple shifts. So that is not indicative that, actual numbers have increased. We see a concentration in the energy sector, the petroleum subsector, because about 80% of these entities that run these ships are in the fuel subsector. So, yes, there's an adoption, but these adoption are not necessarily translating into increased jobs. We are not discounting the fact that some extra hands may have been hired, but we do not have official records to verify this. Then the National Apprenticeship Program set an annual target of 100,000, jobs, quite ambitious. As we speak right now, only 4,350 people have been enrolled in this program. And largely they have been trained in apparel production, hospitality, fashion, and cosmetology, among others. If you look at the target that was set and the number that is enrolled, you could clearly tell that there's more room for improvement. And then finally, on the issue of TVET, a target of 10,000 was planned for 2026. But as we speak, we do not have verifiable information as to the numbers that have been, executed. Now, if we put all this evidence together, we can make the claim that the government needs to do more. We need to move from allocation and into measurable employment outcomes. The way forward is for us to, have a program register and a database or a dashboard that, can report to us in real time how many jobs have been created, because these are flagship programs of the government, and we are of the view that if they should be able to update us very well, maybe it can gain them some political capital in the few years to come. Let's now turn attention to macroeconomic stability and job creation. Jobs are not created in a vacuum. All right, so the strengths of the macroeconomic environment can catalyze job growth. And we have always preached that the private sector is the engine of growth. But if the private sector do not have the enabling environment, it cannot create growth. So if you look at these monetary variables, interest rates, obviously the cost of borrowing. What we see is that there have been some giant gains. The nominal MPR, that's the monetary policy rate, of 14%, and then the real MPR of 8.7%. We also have average lending rate of 16.3. The implication of this is that it is now cheaper to access credit, and that means that private firms, can access more capital to expand their base. And as they do that, they can hire more people. What that also means is that there's more room for SME financing. New jobs can be, created. In terms of liquidity conditions, the M2 Plus has eased. There's a boost in our forex inflows. And that means that once there is stability in the economy, new firms are encouraged to invest and also to have, because it's a good signal for businesses to invest. The banking sector has been stabilized because non-performing loans have declined. What that also means that there's now more lending space to um, inject capital into the productive sectors. In terms of the T-bill rates, there's a decline as well, which means that rather than the private sector being crowded out, there's a crowding in which will reduce financing costs. It is our concerted view that if these macro gains are sustained and stabilized, we can have more jobs being created and the growth can now translate into real jobs. I will invite Dr. Sack again to come and tell us about the prospects and the risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Prince. So, based on all that we have said so far, the 2026 fiscal year, what hope do we have? The prospects include, first, the macroeconomic stability that we have enjoyed, and we are still enjoying. Hopefully it will be sustained. Also, the fiscal discipline led by expenditure cuts. When you listen to the finance minister, he always say that, why should I spend what I don't have? And the answer is that, why don't you raise so that you can spend? Right? But at least it is better to be disciplined on, if you don't have it, then don't spend it. There's also hope, the prospect on the commitment authorization. For me, it's very good. That, or for us, for CPS, that the MDAs need a commitment authorization before they can commit the state to anything. The finance minister must tell you that there's funding before you can go ahead to procure whatever you want to procure. Also, the attempt to minimize the debts of the state-owned enterprises is highly commendable. These 2 points that have been stated earlier set the tone for efficient allocation of resources, both in dollars, for economic growth, and economic transformation, and the creation of sustainable jobs. The central bank's accumulation of gold reserves is also key. Reserves both in dollars and in gold. When we experience inflow of remittances, FDI, and all that, we will build up reserves. I think yesterday the IMF they have paid the last tranche of a little over $300 million, which will help us increase our reserves. As Africa's #1 gold producer, we should do our best to increase our gold holdings. That is why the Ghana Accelerated National Reserve Accumulation Program is important. It's there to purchase about 30% of large-scale miners, and also almost all from the small-scale miners, only the legal ones, not the illegal ones, only the legal small-scale miners. But in the year 2026, there are risks. The risk, first, is not been mentioned, but I'll mention it. First is the revenue shortfall. Because earlier on, we said the prospect lie on the fact that I will not spend what I don't have. But the risk is that when revenue continues to fall, you may be forced to cut expenditure, and my road will not be constructed. I'm very particular about my road. The road to my house is very, very bad. So if you continue to experience revenue shortfall, certain public goods and services may not be provided, and that's a risk. Over-reliance on commodity prices, we don't control gold price, we don't control cocoa price, so any effect on these commodity prices, a downward trend would affect our economy. We do not know the extent to which the geopolitical tension would continue. And you know how it will impact on energy costs and import bills. So if it continues, then it becomes a risk to the year 2026 fiscal year. Obviously, agriculture's reliance on rainfall. We do not have enough irrigation facilities in the country. We have not noticed any credible industrial policy In the previous government, they had 1D, 1F. If you don't like it, then bring a substitute. So far, we have not seen any substitute for an industrial policy. That's why we were of the hope that the 24-hour economy would fill in the gap. But again, so far, it has become more political than economics. In conclusion, I know you have sat down for 1 hour. Sorry about that. In conclusion, the 2026 budget promised a gradual shift from stability to growth to pursue infrastructure development and job creation. But decisive evidence points to the contractionary fiscal policy stance as opposed to expansionary as was promised in the 2026 main budget. Macroeconomic stability, fiscal discipline, and reserve accumulation show prospects for the economy. However, the slow pace of revenue generation, lower public investment, and over-reliance on commodity price and rainfall pose serious risks to achieving the 2026 targets. The success of the budget depends on aggressive revenue mobilization with some complementary domestic borrowing and multilateral loans. You should not be afraid to borrow. I don't know why it's like they are afraid to borrow. The recommendations are: 1, revenue always come on top. That argument that I do not spend what I don't have, we should stop that argument. Because revenue is not an exogenous factor. Revenue is an endogenous factor. It's not that you sleep and somebody say, hey, this is your revenue, so go and spend. No, we have to generate the revenue ourselves. And therefore, efforts must be made to generate revenue and pursue revenue-led fiscal consolidation through aggressive domestic revenue mobilization through the following: the use of tin as a requirement for the acquisition of public goods and services. You want to renew your license, you want to get passport, you want your kid to enjoy free SHS, you must show your tin before these goods and services will be given to you. Other countries are paying tax. Why don't you want to pay tax as a country? The government needs revenue, and therefore we must support the government in its revenue-generating efforts. Then the VAT reforms, taxing the e-commerce. You know the e-levy conversation. Well, CPS, our position again was that the design of e-levy did not sit well with the whole conversation. It does not stop the government from taxing the e-commerce. There are so many businesses online, and we believe that the digital economy is growing, and therefore we call on the government to design a tax that is efficient and tax the online activities. The direct income tax from the informal sector, research has projected to be 1% of GDP. Today's GDP is 1.6 trillion cedis. 1% is 16 billion Ghana cedis potential untapped revenue from the income tax of those in the informal sector. And guess what? 80% of Ghanaian workers are in the informal sector, 80%. And they don't pay personal income tax. Last time, a student of mine told me, EPM told me that his business is to roof buildings, and he told me that he earns so much, even more than lecturers, and I laughed. And it's true. But I pay tax. He doesn't pay tax. He doesn't pay income tax. Those who do graffiato, mason, painting, they earn so much. We must make the effort and tax the incomes of those in the informal sector. Property rates, again, the target is 2% of GDP. That's about 32 billion cedis untapped revenue sitting somewhere. Natural resource, again, research has shown that if we behave like Botswana and command more than half of a natural resource, we can add $4.5 billion annual revenue, additional revenue. That's about 55 billion cedis, additional revenue to our public finance. The next recommendation is that the Ministry of Finance should improve the budget execution, in particular to close the gap on program critical expenditures, to improve public investment and agencies' service delivery and performance. The fight against inflation should not be left in the hands of the Bank of Ghana alone. inflation targeting should be a shared responsibility between the monetary sector, the fiscal sector, and the real sector. We saw how tomatoes and ginger were driving Ghana's inflation. The BOG cannot address those issues. It must be addressed by the real sector. Also address certain supply bottlenecks like storage, irrigation, transport, market logistics, and the rest. We also saw on the regional dashboard that Northeast, Greater Accra, Ashanti, Central, Volta, these regions have their regional inflation above the national average. And therefore, we must visit these regions to identify what is actually happening in those regions, especially my favorite, Northeast. It has been experiencing high inflation for a long time. We have to study that region and know what is going on. Another recommendation is that several job promises were made in the 2026 budget. Efforts must be made to create those sustainable jobs. Otherwise, Ghanaians will hold the government accountable. Again, efforts must be made to develop the non-traditional exports, because the traditional exports are doing well: gold, crude oil, well, cocoa, fine, but the non-traditional exports, we have to be intentional about them. You know, Ghana today has the Policy Coordination Instrument, the PCI, as a replacement for the IMF program, IMF ECF program. It's going to be there for 36 months. How many years? Like 3 years? Yes. Our submission from CPS is that even if we end the PCI, the targeting framework must be internalized, because guess what? We believe that the IMF program and the PCI program will help us achieve and sustain the stability. Why should we throw it away when the IMF have hesitated? We have to internalize it and keep them to keep us in check. And lastly, the data inconsistencies. On one page, you say this figure, the next page is another figure. And it doesn't augur well for us as a republic. These must be addressed. It's been a long journey. At long last, the battle has ended. I thank you so much for your kind attention.